Just trying to figure out how to do this, whether or not this actually works. Yep, I need to wear two pairs of glasses. Is anyone there? So, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we're talking about. So, when I grew up, I had a great blessing of being from a family that was educated, intelligent. And my father was Italian, and both of those, and they were born at the turn of the century. There's a great film called 1900, and that's kind of where my parents were at. But they were still whiter than white, and they both got education. They both, early part of their lives, they weren't married off. My mom didn't really marry in a very interesting position of being in America at its hiatus of power and moneyed. My parents really, especially my mother, didn't really want kids. I mean, she was Catholic, so she kind of had them. But the bottom line, I was the fourth, and there were actually six who died. And so my grandma kind of became my surrogate mother, and her friends my surrogate family. And I was breastfed by a black woman, and they called that wet nursing. And my mom didn't seem to care. My parents didn't care. It was less for them to deal with. So I really had nothing to do with my folks. And I mean, I kind of lived there, but I was being brought up by my grandmother, and she would take me on adventures. And at that time, you could take the trolley on Sunrise Highway into Brooklyn and then get on the subway into Manhattan. And that would cost about a dime. And you could take the Long Island Railroad, which would cost about 45 cents to a dollar. That took you straight into Penn Station. But the other was more interesting. You saw more. You went slow. You saw people come on and get off. And my grandma would always say, so, tell me, observe. What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And wherever there was an interesting thing, like there was a, what do you call it? A place, a circus? No, because it didn't have a tent, but it had a roller coaster and a Ferris wheel and the hobby horse and other rides and, games of chance. And we stopped there because my grandma liked their ice cream and their funnel cakes. I was the only, and, there was no funnel cakes anywhere, but that place was run by Germans. And later on, I found I was a German too. I'm Irish, Italian, Irish, German. My brain is German, my heart is Irish, and everything below my diaphragm is Italian. And the other thing we always stopped at were the movie houses. There were three big movie houses, one in Freeport, and when we got into Queens, there were two, and they were like the big ones, that had 800 to 1,000 seats and a guy with an organ. And we'd go on weekdays when there'd be nobody in there. The guy would still be playing the organ, and there'd still be the cartoons and then the movie. And my grandmother said that movies and television later on were the subconscious of the American culture. I had to realize that my grandma was like 5'2", your basic Italian grandma. She kind of looked like a little refrigerator dressed in black. And so anything with my grandma was an adventure. And when we stayed home, she cooked or worked in the garden, or her friends came over, and it was like a tea party. And all her friends were women, and so I was surrounded and raised by women, as most children are. And they would talk about their husbands, and I saw what misogyny was, and I saw what racism was, and I saw what sexism was, and I saw that all of those things were more or less a smokescreen to class. Because in New York City, Manhattan, and where my parents and grandmother lived in Freeport and Glen Cove were the only two cities in all of Long Island. The rest were villages and towns. And that was because that's where the rich people lived. And cities organized in a way that the rich people could have more control and ownership. And so these are all, and so these women were, not because there was two black women, 3 Italian women, 2 Jewish women, a Hungarian woman, a Russian woman, and they were all pretty well educated, especially the Hungarian and Russian, because they had come from well-to-do families, and when the revolution hit, they had the, Amscray, and they left town and hit America with nothing. And yet they were very well educated, and they were the teachers. And they would talk about class more than anything. And my father's friends, were businessmen and men of finance, and they never talked about class. My mom, she was just into running everything. And so, she didn't think of class except she was at the top of the pyramid. And we would take the trolley and subway into Manhattan, and then we would go all over the place, because New York City was not the city of the rich. It was the city of the working class and manufacturing. There were factories everywhere. The garment district was the most obvious. Brooklyn Navy Yard, along the East River up into Queens. It was like Venice. There were all these inlets, and there were all kinds of factories that manufactured, and they used the waterways to, transport their commodities, the things they needed and the things they sold. And we went all over the place and looked at all of this. And my grandma, because when she came off the boat with my grandfather, lived in New York City first. And it wasn't really until they become middle class his clientele lived, meaning the rich people and the entertainers, because the Hollywood of the East Coast, Freeport, because that's where all the people who were the showmen of the theater, and all the movie theaters, not theaters, but places they made movies, were in Long Island. So it was an interesting time for me, because it was definitely a transition period. And Moore's law says that every 2 years, computing power goes up by half. And from my birth until now, American culture and its power and its place on the planet increased. Really since the United States found its manifest destiny with the Spanish-American War, because it took over the Caribbean, defeating the Spanish took over the Caribbean and Asia. We got Hawaii, all of the little islands, and the Philippines. The Philippines almost became a state. We just settled to make Hawaii a state. And we moved into China and Japan after bringing Japan into the 20th century and making them, we did to Japan what we did to China, meaning we rose them out of feudal dynamics, gave them industrial development, gave them a market, meaning they brought all their products to us, and we gave them all the raw materials. But in the 20s, after World War I, because their Navy was the big, their Navy defeated the Russian Navy in World War I. And, or in that time period, not having anything to do with World War I, they just wanted Russia out of their sphere of influence. And that's when we cut them off. We gave them no more raw materials. So that's what pushed them into Indonesia and Southeast Asia and into China, because they needed raw materials and markets and land to grow. So the United States has been doing this, forever. Well, as long as we've been a country. And our slavery is total, meaning it's not just black people, it's everybody. But New York City was this amazing place where every 3 blocks was a different nationality. I mean, if you screwed up in one neighborhood, you could, go 16 blocks away and get an apartment, and, no one knew you, and you could start over again. And everyone was doing that. And rents were very cheap. And with FDR, New York City was the workers' paradise, meaning they had rent control, they had energy control, and they had free health care and free education. Between the 1920s and 1960, the New York City school system had more Nobel laureates than any other country. And all of these things are, just swept under the carpet. No one, talk about history. History is always put in the dustbin of dusty facts. No, history is quite an interesting time. And if you are old enough, you've lived history. And if you had enough space, meaning I never had children, I never had anything that like my parents, they had to worry about us. And being the youngest, I was very lucky because my parents almost forgot I existed, especially since I hung out with my grandma so much. But I hung out with my mom. She loved to read and loved to write, and she tried to instill that in me. And I enjoyed reading with my mom. That was some of the funnest times. And my mother and I, she did not do that with my other brothers and sisters. She was always too busy trying to keep them under her thumb. Anyway, so going through New York City, my grandma, she knew every place to go for free. And she had a bag that was almost as big as she was, and she had everything in there, and she had this one little box of these pins, corporate pins, and I had no idea where she got them. But if you were wearing this pin, you could go to the corporate dining room, and we would go all over Manhattan, to General Motors, General Electric, Westinghouse, every place that had a corporate head in, Rockefeller Center, and we'd go into the executive dining room. We had those little pins on. And the guy at the door just kind of nodded. We walked in, and my grandmother would have this suitcase that was she would just scoop the food and walk out with a suitcase full of food. And I learned from my grandma to never ask for permission, and if you ever were stopped, you would just apologize, say, "Oh, I have no idea." And little Italian grandma and a little boy wearing a camel's hair coat and camel's hair hat and shine shoes was, okay, don't do it again. But we never got stopped. We never had to apologize. And the other thing my grandma said was that whenever you walked into a room, you had to own it. You had to be the person that no one ever questioned. And we would go through the museums, Museum of Natural History, there was a museum, part of the Museum of Natural History, which was the Museum of American Indian, where during the Indian Wars, all of the rich people stole all the Indian artifacts and put them in a museum in New York City, saying, "Oh, we can protect them." It wasn't until, the 1980s that the Indians got partial control of that back. And so going to that museum, you really saw what happened to the American Indians, going to the Museum of Natural History, you really saw what happened to nature. At the Council on Foreign Relations, they had a really great little place called Automation House, which was all about technology. And nobody ever went in there, and all these great scientists who retired were it was like a high school science fair. And that's where I met Billy Kluver. And he was the first person, this guy, first of all, he was a great scientist and an electrician. He knew Tesla. He was one of the first people who really told me about Tesla. I was about 6 when I heard about Nikola Tesla from Billy Kluver. And then he went to Europe before World War I and studied, because that's where all the great scientists and scientific and engineering schools were. And he went to the Sorbonne, and he went to German institutes of technology, and he was in Berlin and Paris and Prague, and that's where he really got turned on by the arts. So he brought European art, contemporary art, to America. Before he did an art show called the Armory Show. He curated it and brought the artist over. And because he was, came from a wealthy family, well connected, this is a good thing. And he did it in the New York Armory, which is right now where the Museum of Modern Art is. And that's why it was called the Armory Show. So kids, go look up the Armory Show. There's only one person watching? Anyway, he also, was very involved with radar in the RAD labs. And so he was this amazing scientist, unbelievably connected into the cultural world. He helped start the National Endowment of the Arts. He was on their board. He was on the board of the Museum of Modern Art. He was on board of all of the museums, Guggenheim, Whitney, all of them. And so he was like my godfather of culture. And later on in my life, in the 70s, he was one of the guys who really, made me a successful artist in the art world of New York in the 70s, which was a pretty amazing thing. Anyway, so it's about 20 minutes, and I'm going to stop right here. I'm going to see how quickly this loads. Okay. How do I stop this? Oh, you want that? Yes.